Hi, welcome to Health 401, Health Policy and Governance. Today we're going to be covering Module 3, focusing on health governance, a roadmap to health equity and social justice. In doing so, we want to be able to understand what governance is, what health governance is, and how to evaluate health governance systems so that we can affect change in health governance. And so first I want you to begin with a bit of self-evaluation and reflection. Can you define and describe governance? Can you define and describe health governance? What steps would you take to evaluate health governance systems? And how would you use those steps to affect change in and through health governance? And so you can take a moment to think through that or to actually give those things a try. And then rate yourself from 1, being not at all capable, to 5, completely capable. And the goal of today's lecture is to move you from that not at all capable category to the completely capable category. So beginning with understanding what governance means. Health governance has been an important topic in public health and in international development because ultimately it's understanding how we affect change within a health system. Now, in order to think through health governance, we first have to start with the definition of governance and what governance looks like. And so governance has been defined in a variety of ways, but broadly, it includes things like politics and legislation and policy, the application of those policies and laws through public administration, and then their interaction with civil society and the private sector, and what these interactions have in terms of effects on socioeconomic and governance consequences and outcomes, things I think generally governments care about. And then particularly important is the evaluation of these efforts and make sure that we strive for good governance and achieve the things that we collectively have decided through our governance structures are important to us. And so this ends up being quite broad and diverse. It encompasses many functions and activities and interventions that apply to and cut across all sectors. In thinking about this from a top-down approach, last week we talked about legislation and policy and on-the-ground administration. And so taking that idea of social policy and health policy and now looking at how it interacts with individuals through civil society, the private sector, and communities and other interest groups. And then taking those interactions and looking back up and see what do we have to adjust at the legislative, policy, and administration levels to ensure that people have good experiences being governed, having access to healthcare, and that sort of thing. So a variety of these conceptualization of governance are on this slide. And you see that voice and accountability, participation, rule of law, strategic vision, fairness and transparency, participation in human rights and human development, making policy, laws, and rules. These are all sorts of things that come together to describe what we think of when we think of governance. You can also look at the types of organizations that have ideas around governments. Organizations like the World Bank, which focus on international development, mostly through economic means. The United Nations, which focuses on international collaboration. The ODI, which focuses on overseas development. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which focuses on human development. And USAID, which focuses on providing, again, human development throughout the world, particularly from an American approach in doing so. And so these conceptualizations of governance, of course, are varied and diverse. And I think that's what's an important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about what is governance. That there's not necessarily one conceptualization of what it means to govern and what the role of governance structures is in society and systems and institutions. I think there are 4 general features of governance, especially if we think about a governance that is aimed towards improving and being what we would consider a good government. This begins with implementation. Implementation is the sort of things that governments do. It's managing finances, It's setting up organizational structures and bureaucracy. It's figuring out how to ascertain the resources and the skills and the skilled workers to accomplish these sort of things through procurement, and then to deliver the services that people end up needing. Oftentimes this occurs through like contracting, bidding, and so we also have to engage in an implementation of a regulatory structure that ensures that that vision and mandate that the governance structure sets up is carried through to meet its expectations. The second part of governance is accountability. Accountability looks at oversight, and so parliamentary oversight, judicial oversight of activities. It looks at evaluation, making sure that programs are effective, making sure that money is spent well. It's transparency, which means government data, government information is available. People are able to assess what it is their governments are engaging in, and ensuring that watchdogs and press groups and media groups have the ability to hold lead governors account for the types of governance that they're enacting on the ground. And so you can imagine that depending on where you're at in the world, your ability to have good governance is strongly constricted by values around accountability and values around what we think of as a democratic or inclusive approach to governance. This connects to the third area of governance, which is civil engagement. Civil engagement focuses on local participation, engaging communities and the private sector, and working with non-government organizations and CBOs, because it's important in governance to include the voices of all people, and not just those who have been hired on as bureaucrats. And finally, human rights. Human rights has to be a central part of governance. Human rights focuses on democracy, defense of civil liberties, protections of minorities, and taking an equity-focused lens towards governing. This ensures that justice, this ensures that equality and equity are not only just a sideshow to governance, but are kind of weaved throughout everything they do. This connects to each of the other categories: how things are implemented, how things are accounted for, and how communities are engaged with, largely depends on the governance structure's vision for human rights. And so you likely have a sense of governance simply because you have a sense of government. And indeed, health governance specifically looks at health systems and assess what it is that can be done in governance to promote the health of people. In the words of WHO, it involves ensuring a strategic policy framework. It ensures that exists with effective oversight, coalition building, regulation, and attention to systems design and accountability. Now, as a motivating example of this is data from an analysis I recently undertook looking at spatial dimensions of health in BC, Washington, and Oregon. And one of the things you see when looking at this graph is between 1992 and 2016, these are 5-year aggregate life expectancy estimates, you see that overall life expectancy at birth increased, evidenced by more green. Particularly, you look in the southern part of British Columbia, throughout a lot of the rural areas. We see that lots of people have achieved high life expectancies while others have not. And that's linked to their geography, to their place, to their land, to where they live. I think you also notice that there's that bright red spot in the image on the left. And you see that that is the central coastal region. And so when we dive deeper and look at governance in the central coastal region, we know that the Bella Coola people in that region were first had colonial contact in 1793 and then sporadic contact until Norwegian settlement in 1800s. Eventually, Norwegians abandoned the region due to economic decline. This is important because the regional district had a traditional economic base centered on natural resources and extraction, and then declined due to broader industry trends and depletion of key resources in the forestry and fishing sectors. And so in thinking through how does this affect health and how does it affect life expectancy, we can go to then look at, well, is it something about the fundamental dynamics of that place, or is it something about the policies there? And I think while we've yet to answer that question in the research, you can compare a few things in the census profile that will give you a good understanding of what might be contributing to some of the disparities in life expectancy that are experienced there in the Central Coastal Regional District. So first, you might expect, well, maybe people are simply older there, and therefore mortality is at a higher rate, and so it's making it look like life expectancy at birth is actually higher than it is. But when you look at the median age, it's actually a few years younger than the province on a whole, 41.3 versus 43 years of age. And so we have to think deeper about what might be contributing to this. And so I think about things like family income, which is a standard kind of social determinant of health. And you see that family incomes are much lower in the Central Coastal region compared to the province as a whole. Now, this also is not that surprising because it costs more to live somewhere like Vancouver or Victoria than it does to live somewhere, like the Central Coastal region in Bella Coola, for example. And so largely, this difference in economics may simply reflect a difference in the cost of living. And so it's important to look at this and consider how that might be at play as well. And there are methods using cost-adjusted, CPI and other consumer indices to really get at, some of those income measures. We also look at, relationships, the percent of people that are single, for example. We think about how things like loneliness can impact health through creating additional stress and depression and mental health challenges, which could potentially lead to other problems. And so when we think about it in terms of that, we see that that's maybe part of the story here. 47.3% are single versus 41.9%. So less connection might be part of the story, particularly if we think about maybe amongst older adults, what are the patterns of connection? Because we know those of you who are experts in aging and health and on that track kind of have a good sense of the impact that aging could have and loneliness interacting with that could have in life expectancy. I think one of the most striking findings of looking at the Central Coastal Regional District is looking at the percent of people who are Indigenous or identify as Indigenous on the census. As what we see is 61.9% of people in the Coastal Regional District identify as Indigenous versus 5.9% for the province overall. And for me, this tells me something about the regional district that we're looking at. And it tells me something about what the governance structure is doing for Indigenous people. Now, this is correlation and not causation, and so that could be recognized. And these are preliminary results looking into this. But I think we cannot forget that system of colonization and how that is reflected then in the data. And I also look at things like unemployment, in which you see that the unemployment rate, while not quite double, is actually quite elevated compared to the province as a whole. And so all of these things to come together that are all what I would consider indicators that governance is all interested in. Health governance is interested in those things too, because we take on, as we talked about last week when talking about health policy, that you have to take a health in all policies approach and understand how economic relations, Indigenous settler relations, how those sorts of things impact and shape our health. In thinking about conceptualizations around health governance, there have been several offered. The World Health Organization recognizing its role in world health governance and giving an advising role to governments, local governments, and particularly those in developing countries. Focus around things like policy guidance, providing intelligence and oversight, providing collaboration and coalition building, regulation of health, systems designed, and accountability. You can reflect on how that relates back to some of the ways other organizations, who are mostly coming from an international development context, have perceived health governance. You can also look at other academic perceptions of what health governance is, and look across these three and assess how are these different overall than the ones that we looked at with just governance. And I think a few of the things that stand out to me as different is the generation of intelligence and the surveillance of public health, which again is an important and essential public health function that maybe normal governance structures don't prioritize so much, because watching over the health is not always important to an overall system of governance. And so health governance, I think, represents governance, but with a focus on health. And so it adds additional responsibilities, it frees up some additional responsibilities, but I think those same four basic principles of implementation, of accountability, of human rights, and of community engagement continue to be important aspects of health governance. And so thinking this through, I want you to think about what similarities and differences were important in those lists. And I want you to think through what domains you think are useful to construct to understand governance. I've presented a 4 area domains, but maybe those aren't really what you think to be the important ones. And I'm interested to hear what your thoughts, and so certainly on the discussion boards or other places, you can share that with me and we can get a better sense of that.